Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
Miss Crewe was born in 1821. She got some education, and when she was 20, she became a teacher for an 8-year-old girl named Martha Bond. Miss Crewe stayed as Martha's teacher for 10 years. After that, Martha grew up and Miss Crewe went to teach another family. Martha married a man named Mr. William Harper. A year later, Martha had a baby boy named Edward. This was in the year 1853. When Edward was 6 years old, Miss Crewe came back to be his teacher. She stayed for 4 years until Edward went to school. Then, Miss Crewe left to teach someone else. By then, she was 42 years old. 12 years later, Mrs. Harper, Martha, died. Before she passed away, she asked her husband to take care of Miss Crewe because Miss Crewe was very sick and could not work as a teacher anymore. Mr. Harper loved his wife very much. He told his lawyer to give Miss Crewe £150 every year. He thought about buying her something called an annuity, money paid regularly for life, but she was so sick that he decided not to. Edward was now 22 years old. In 1888, Mr. Harper died after being sick for a short time. For 13 years, he thought Miss Crewe would die soon, but she didn't. Before he died, he told Edward to take care of Miss Crewe. This is what Mr. Harper said to Edward. "That old Miss Crewe, Eddie. You have to take care of her. Keep giving her the money, but don't buy her an annuity. If you do, she'll probably die right after." Mr. Harper passed away soon after. Edward was now 35 years old. Miss Crewe was 67 and still very sick. Edward listened to his father and didn't buy an annuity for her. He kept paying her £150 every year, but now the money came from him, not from his father's lawyer. Edward had his own plans for the large fortune his father left him. Sadly, his plans were not smart. He told his lawyers to sell all the safe investments his father had made, like houses and railway stocks, and give him the money. Edward used the money to invest in things that promised high returns, but they were risky. Because of this, in just 12 years, Edward lost most of his money. His yearly income went from £3,000 to only £400. Even though Edward was not smart with money, he was a good man. He kept paying Miss Crewe her £150 every year. This left him only £250 for himself. The little money he had left was invested in a Mexican brewery, a place that makes beer. Edward trusted it completely. Now Edward started to think about earning extra money. The only thing he knew how to do was paint. He was not very good at it, but he decided to take lessons from a young artist he knew. By this time, Edward was 47 years old and Miss Crewe was 79. The year was 1900. Everyone was very surprised when Edward quickly became better at painting. His pictures were actually quite nice. He sent one of his paintings to an art show at the Academy. It was accepted and, to his surprise, it was sold for £10. Edward was now an artist. Soon, Edward started earning between 30 and 40 pounds a year from his paintings. Then he earned more than 100 pounds and later 200 pounds. But then, the Mexican brewery failed because General Malfico burned it down just for fun. This happened in the spring of 1914. Edward was now 61 years old, and Miss Crewe was 93. After paying Miss Crewe her money, Edward had only about 50 pounds a year for himself if his paintings continued to sell. A single man could survive more or less on 50 pounds a year. Then the Great War started. In the autumn of 1914, older men became very important again. As younger men left for the war, older men took over farm work and earned good wages. In offices, the younger workers were sent to fight, so older workers struggled to keep things running until women were hired to help. No man was too old for a job anymore. Even men over 80 years old could find work. Some cinemas even dressed old men in uniforms and paid them to stand at the doors. Edward, however, could only paint watercolors, which were nice but not very special. Sadly, no one wanted his kind of paintings anymore. During the war, people saved their money to invest in war loans. They stopped buying small, pretty watercolors as gifts. Only famous artists, whose work was seen as a good investment, could still sell their paintings. Edward faced a big problem. He might soon have no money for food. This was not just his problem. It was also Miss Crewe's. Edward was a man of honor. Even though Edward hated Miss Crewe, he had promised to take care of her. So he had to make sure she had money, even if it meant he would go hungry. Edward wrapped some of his paintings in brown paper and started looking for work. He went to large stores that sold paper and cards. He offered to design Christmas cards, calendars, and other things like that. Edward's hard times had made him think more clearly. Even though he was old, the stores didn't turn him away. He was allowed to show his paintings. After unpacking and repacking his samples about 30 times, one store finally gave him work. His paintings were actually quite nice. The job was piecework, which meant he was paid for each piece he made. He could work from anywhere, not in the store. If he worked very hard, day and night, he could earn as much as 4 pounds a week. Edward worked hard and brought his finished work to the store every Monday. The people at the store liked his work and accepted almost everything he made. Although they didn't offer him more money, they encouraged him to keep painting. Edward was lucky to have found this work. In the first year of the war, Edward worked like a slave and lived in terrible conditions. He earned just enough money to survive and still pay Miss Crewe her 150 pounds. In the second year, he did the same. By the fourth year of the war, Edward was still alive and still paying Miss Crewe on time. But Miss Crewe found that 150 pounds was no longer enough. Everything was becoming more expensive. She wrote a letter to Edward, saying that prices were going up everywhere and asking if he could give her more money. She mentioned his dear mother and father, reminded him of the happy times they had shared in the old schoolroom, and signed the letter, "Yours affectionately." Edward asked the store he worked for to pay him more money. He explained that everything was getting more expensive. The store, knowing they were getting a good deal with Edward's work, agreed to pay him more. Edward started earning £5 a week. He increased Miss Crewe's allowance by £50. However, Edward's own life became even harder. The cost of paper and paints kept going up. He worked all the time, stopping only to sleep, which he couldn't do well, and eat, which he couldn't afford much. By now, Edward was 64 and Miss Crewe was almost 97. Edward had been sick for a while. On Armistice Day, the day the war ended, he took an hour off from work to join people in the streets celebrating. He caught a bad cold. The next day, instead of resting, he went to the city to deliver some finished designs. That night, he felt very sick. The next night, he was delirious. By the third night, Edward was dead. 2 days before he died, Edward sent Miss Crewe her quarterly allowance of £50. After doing this, he had only 4 shillings and 2 pence left in his bank account. When he died, there was no money left to pay for his burial, so he was buried by the parish. Miss Crewe received her money. She was very happy and wrote her usual letter to Edward, thanking him warmly. She added a note asking if he could send her a little more money next time because life was getting harder every day. The letter arrived after Edward had already died. Miss Crewe took her money order to her bank and asked them to add it to her savings account. She noted that this made her total savings exactly £2,000.